I'm honored this morning to welcome Richard Rothstein to our fellows graduation ceremony today. Richard is no stranger to the Hudson Valley. I heard him speak in Dutchess County a few years ago, greatly enjoyed his presentation. Not to mention his book, The Color of Law, a forgotten history of how our government segregated America. Richard's work provides an amazing historical context of how land use, zoning, and lending systems directly influenced what our communities and neighborhoods look like in terms of socioeconomics, demographics, and the built environment, otherwise known as our infrastructure. Richard is a distinguished fellow of the Economic Policy Institute, the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and of the Haas Institute at the University of California at Berkeley. In addition to his book, The Color of Law, he has authored many other articles and books on race and education, including Class of Schools, using social, economic, and educational improvement to close the Black-White achievement gap, and Grading Education, Getting Accountability Right. I could go on and on with Richard's accomplishments over the years, but at this point, I'd love to just introduce and say good morning to Richard and welcome to our fellows graduation.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jonathan and Joe. Joe, it's good to see you again, and thanks to all of you for engaging with me in this conversation today. I understand that all or most of you have read my book, The Color of Law, so I'm not going to simply repeat what that book says. I'll try to leave as much time for a discussion as I can, and to take care of your questions. And if there are questions I can't get to, feel free to email me, and I'll try to respond to as many of them as I possibly can. Let me begin by saying that in the 20th century, we had a civil rights movement in this country. It began by challenging racial segregation in law schools, and then went on to challenge it in colleges and universities. And then in 1954, as you know, in the Brown versus Board of Education decision, the civil rights movement succeeded in getting the Supreme Court to prohibit ongoing legal segregation in elementary and secondary schools. But that Brown decision then led to something different, a movement of activists. They engaged in marches and demonstrations and civil disobedience, and people lost their lives in the struggle to redress segregation. Many more were injured, some very seriously. Last year we celebrated the life of John Lewis, one of the most courageous civil rights activists in our history. By the end of the 1960s, that civil rights movement pretty much persuaded the country, not everybody, but pretty much, that racial segregation was wrong, that it was immoral, that it was harmful both to African Americans and to whites, that it was incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy. And with that understanding, through the 1960s, we succeeded in ending segregation in public accommodations, in restaurants, in public transportation, buses, in employment in many cases. And in 1968, in the wake of the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., we adopted a fair housing law that prohibited ongoing discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. But then we left untouched the biggest segregation of all. The civil rights movement pretty much ended. Left untouched the fact that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. Every one that I've lived in had clearly defined areas that were white or almost all white, black or almost all black. How could it be if we came to an understanding that racial segregation was wrong, immoral, harmful to both blacks and whites, incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy? How could it be that we left untouched the biggest segregation of all. And I guess partly you could say, well, it's hard to redress residential segregation. If we pass an ordinance prohibiting the segregation of restaurants, well, the next day you can go to any restaurant you want, sit anywhere in that restaurant that you want, like anybody else. But if we pass a law prohibiting segregation of neighborhoods, the next day things wouldn't look much different. It's much harder to undo. And so what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, blacks and whites, liberals, conservatives, Northerners, Southerners, Democrats, Republicans, what we've done, all of us, is adopted a national rationalization, an excuse. We give ourselves from turning our gaze away from the segregation of neighborhoods and failing to do anything about it as we redressed public accommodations and employment and transportation and so forth in the 1960s. And that rationalization goes something like this. We tell ourselves that the segregation forms that we addressed during the civil rights movement of the 60s, that was all done by government, that segregation. The government was requiring restaurants to be segregated in many states. That was a 14th Amendment violation, a violation of the Constitution, a civil rights violation, something that as American citizens, we have an obligation to redress. If the federal government was requiring segregation, as it was in many of those cases, interstate transportation, for example, that was a Fifth Amendment violation, something that's also our obligation as American citizens to redress. But residential segregation, we tell ourselves that's something entirely different. That wasn't done by government. That wasn't done by law, by regulation, by ordinance. That just sort of happened naturally, happened by accident. It happened because bigoted white homeowners, right, or landlords may have refused to rent or sell homes to African Americans in white neighborhoods. Or maybe private businesses, real estate agencies, banks, law firms, insurance companies, developers, all practiced racial discrimination in their purely private sector activities, not as agents of government. Too bad, but this was private activity, not a civil rights violation. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's all because people just like to live with each other of the same race. We choose to live in neighborhoods that are predominantly the same race as we are. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's all an economic thing. On average, African Americans have lower incomes than whites, and so many of them just can't afford to move to middle-class white neighborhoods. That's why we have segregation. All of these individual, bigoted, private sector actions, self-choice, income differences is what's created residential segregation. And we tell ourselves that what happened by accident can only unhappen by accident. What happened naturally can only unhappen naturally. We think it's too bad, many of us, but we don't feel an obligation to do anything about it. We give a name to this rationalization. We say that what we've got when it comes to neighborhoods is de facto segregation, something that just happened in fact, not in law. Well, as you know, the theme of the color of law is that rationalization is mythical. There's no basis in reality to it whatsoever. The residential segregation that we have in this country, everywhere, in every metropolitan area, is not an accident, didn't happen naturally. It's as unconstitutional as the forms of segregation that we addressed in the 20th century. It was created, sustained, reinforced, and perpetuated by government in violation of the Constitution, the Fifth Amendment, and the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. And as such, we have an obligation to remedy it, an obligation that we've never assumed and never taken up because of this excuse we give ourselves that it all happened naturally, a completely factless excuse. Well, as Joe described, I spent a lot of time writing about education policy. I came to understand that the biggest problem we face in public education in this country is the segregation of public schools, the fact that blacks and whites are typically taught in separate schools, predominantly separate schools in this country. Actually, the segregation of schools today is more intense than it has been at any time in the last 45 years. And the reason that those schools are segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So I began to think that maybe neighborhood segregation was an educational problem. That's how I came to this topic. That's how I came to write the book, The Color of Law. We were following in the late 1990s and early 2000s a policy in education that I thought made no sense, and I wrote many articles and columns about it, books even. The policy said that the reason that African American children have lower scores on average than white children is because teachers have low expectations of Black children. They just don't try very hard. And if only we can force teachers to try harder, hold them accountable for the test scores of their children, the achievement gap will disappear. I thought this was a ludicrous idea, but we enacted it into law, broadly supported across the political spectrum. In 2001, we adopted a law called the No Child Left Behind law that required schools to test children every year, identify the average test scores by racial group. And the law predicted that if we do that and hold teachers and schools accountable for their children's test scores, the achievement gap will disappear in a matter of 7 years. Well, it's now 20 years later. The achievement gap not only hasn't disappeared, it hasn't much budged. The law had no basis in reality. The prediction was completely flawed. And I tried to explain in much of my writings and books why this was a flawed theory. Of course, there are some teachers who are bigoted, some teachers who have low expectations of Black children, some schools that just don't try very hard to educate them. But that's a very small part of the reason why we have this achievement gap. The reason we have an achievement gap is because so many African American children with serious social and economic disadvantages come to school with social and economic impediments that prevent them from taking advantage of what even the best schools that try as hard as they can do. I was a New York Times education columnist around the turn of the century, and I remember writing one article about asthma. As you may know, African American children have asthma in metropolitan areas that can be as high as 4 times the rate of middle class children. 4 times the rate is an enormous difference. They have asthma at such a high rate because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, more diesel trucks driving through, more vermin in the environment, more dilapidated buildings. And if a child has asthma, that child is more likely than a child who doesn't. That's not true in every case, but more likely than a child who doesn't to be up at night wheezing and then come to school drowsy the next day. And if a child is drowsy, that child is less able to take advantage of good instruction, will do more poorly on tests by a very small amount. But if you have 2 groups of children who are identical in every respect, same racial breakdown, same social and economic background, same family structure, but one group has a higher rate of asthma than the other, that group's going to have lower average achievement no matter how hard teachers try. Well, when we concentrate those children, not only who have asthma, but with many other social and economic challenges like lead poisoning that has a measurable impact on IQ, or homelessness or economic insecurity, we try to concentrate those children in single schools. They overwhelm the ability of schools to do anything but try to deal with these social and economic disadvantages. And that's the main reason we have an achievement gap. Well, this is what I was thinking about some years ago. And then in 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision. I mentioned this in the book. The Supreme Court was evaluating a very token school desegregation plan that had been implemented in Seattle, Washington, and Louisville, Kentucky. In both places, the school districts had given parents the choice of which school in the district their child would attend. But if the choice was going to exacerbate racial segregation, intensify it, the choice wouldn't be honored. So if you had a school which was all white or mostly white, and there was one place left in that school or a couple of places left, and you had a Black and a white child applying for those last places, the Black child would be given some preference to help to desegregate the school. This was a trivial program. You don't have one or a couple of places left in the school very often, and you have to choose between different race applicants. But the Supreme Court denounced this program, said you couldn't do such a thing. They said that the reason that the schools in Louisville and Seattle were segregated was because the neighborhoods in which they segregated. That's true. The decision was written by Chief Justice John Roberts, and he said that those neighborhoods are segregated not because of government activity, but de facto for the reasons I described before: private bigotry and actions in the private economy, self-choice and income differences. And he said, well, you have de facto segregation, something government didn't create. Government is prohibited under the Constitution by doing anything to fix it. Well, I read this decision and remembered something that happened in Louisville, Kentucky, some years before. In Louisville, Kentucky, one of the two districts that was this decision concerned, there was a white homeowner in a single-family home in an all-white suburb called Shively. That white homeowner had an African-American friend living in the center city of Louisville. He was a decorated Navy veteran. He had a wife and a child. He wanted to move to a single-family home, but nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner bought a second home in his suburb, resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American family moved in, an angry mob surrounded the home, protected by the local police. The mob threw rocks through the windows. The police made no effort to stop it. They dynamited and firebombed the home. Police made no effort to stop that. But when the riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition for having sold a home in a white neighborhood to a black family. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. The police, the criminal justice system, the prosecutors, the courts, these are agents of government. This is a 14th Amendment violation, not de facto segregation. And I began to look into it further. And I found that Louisville, Kentucky was not an isolated case. And I'm not exaggerating here. There were hundreds and hundreds of cases of police-protected violence, mob violence against African Americans who had legitimately purchased or rented homes in previously white neighborhoods, violence designed to drive them out of those neighborhoods. In some cases, the police not only protected the mobs, they organized and led them. And every one of these cases, and they took place in New York. There were cases of this kind of mob violence to drive African Americans out of homes, not only in New York, but Detroit, Chicago, Washington, Baltimore, Kansas City, Denver, Los Angeles, San Francisco. This was not just a Southern phenomenon. Every one of these was a civil rights violation, a violation of the Constitution. Every one of them requires us to remedy it if we take our responsibilities of American citizenship seriously. Yet we've never undertaken that obligation. Well, as you know, the book, The Color of Law, goes through many, many federal, state, and local policies designed to segregate this country, ensure that it remains segregated. I won't take time to go into many of them. I know you've read the book, but perhaps the most powerful of them was the Federal Housing and Veterans Administrations that suburbanized the country in the post-World War II period, 1950s, prohibiting African Americans from purchasing homes that were easily affordable to them in the post-war period, in a program designed to house returning war veterans. Black and white returning war veterans could easily have afforded those homes. And these are suburbs all over the country. The one I described in the book, you may recall, is Levittown, New York, but that's the biggest one, 17,000 homes in one place. Levitt, the builder, could never have assembled the capital to build these homes on his own. No bank would be crazy enough to lend him the money to do it. We were in a suburban country that time. The banks thought this was a crazy idea, building 17,000 homes outside the city. The only way he could do it was by going to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, submitting his plans for the development, the materials he was going to use, the architectural design, the layout of the streets, and a federally required commitment that he never sell homes to African Americans in these developments that were federally sponsored. The Federal Housing Administration even required Levitt and builders like this all over the country to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This is just one policy. It's the notion of de facto segregation, as I say, is utter nonsense. There's no basis in reality to it whatsoever. Those homes sold at the time, and this is true in suburbs all over the country, they sold at the time for about $8,000 a piece. And in today's money, inflation adjusted, that's about $100,000. You can't buy a home today in Levittown or any of these communities in the Hudson Valley or anywhere for $100,000. They sell, depending on the area of the country, for at least $200,000, sometimes $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, in some places $1 million or more. The African Americans were prohibited from buying these homes. The result is that whites gained wealth from the appreciation and the value of their homes. They used it to send their children to college. They used it to take care of perhaps temporary emergencies, short-term unemployment, or maybe a medical situation. They used it to subsidize their retirements. And they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who were then able to have down payments for their own homes. African Americans, I say, prohibited from participating in this wealth generating program. I heard as I was introduced, and as Jonathan was speaking about before, that you've focused a lot on moving forward, on improving, for example, equity, diversity, and inclusion in the institutions in which you work. So let's take, for example, the segregation of a place like Levittown, and you can do this for any metropolitan area in the country. The homes sold in the mid-20th century, easily affordable to African Americans. Anybody in the post-war with a job in the post-war economy can afford a home for $100,000 with a 20, 30-year amortized mortgage. African Americans were easily able to afford them. Whites who moved into these homes paid less in their monthly carrying charges than they were paying for rent in public housing. Well, today they're unaffordable to African Americans. Simply reforming the real estate industry so that it no longer steers African Americans to Black neighborhoods, no longer refuses to sell them homes in places like Levittown, will do very, very little to redress that segregation. Very few African Americans, very few whites actually, have the money, unless they have down payments from their parents, to purchase homes for the prices that homes in these suburbs now cost. Recently, I wrote an article in the New York Times, perhaps you saw it, it's not so about 8 months ago now, in which I described a neighborhood in California it was, but I could have written the same kind of thing about Levittown or any of these others. A neighborhood in California created in the 1940s by a developer, a real estate agency, a bank for whites only. That neighborhood is still completely white. It now sells not for the $100,000 that the homes cost in the 1940s, but for $1 million. Simply passing a Fair Housing Act or getting the real estate agency in that community to act in a non-discriminatory fashion won't do much to desegregate, or anything to desegregate that neighborhood. In Levittown, as a result of the Fair Housing Act, I think that currently about 2%, maybe between 1 and 2% of those 17,000 homes are now owned by African Americans. Of course, there are some who can afford a home for $400,000 without government assistance. But Levittown is located in a broader neighborhood that's about 15% African American. So that difference between 2% and 15%, that 13% of homes, that difference is the difference that cannot be redressed simply by doing things better now than we did in the past, simply by eliminating implicit bias and explicit bias. The only way we're going to redress that is by a government program that's as powerful as the programs that the government used to segregate it. The government should be, and I mentioned this in the book, should be buying up homes in Levittown at current market rates, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, and reselling them at deeply discounted prices to African Americans. as a narrowly targeted remedy for a very specific constitutional violation. In that article I wrote in the Times a few months ago, and I think I'll be able to send you a link to it after this event is over. In that article, I said that I was able to identify the bank, the real estate agency, the developer that segregated that community in the 1940s. All of those, or their successor firms, are still around today. Those firms should be contributing to a fund that subsidizes African Americans, along with the federal government, to move into that community that's now unaffordable to them. I'm writing a new book about what we can do to redress segregation. I asked Michelle earlier if any of you want me to let you know when the book is ready. I will. It's filled with examples. There are many, many things that we should do to redress segregation. Let me mention, in the little time I have left, I'll mention one other thing that we could do to fix this. I heard Jonathan talking about ongoing implicit bias, and as well as a good deal of explicit bias. We saw that in the exposés of real estate agents who continued to steer African Americans to Black neighborhoods. But actually, implicit bias and explicit bias is the least of the obstacles that we face in redressing segregation. Most of the obstacles that we face are the result of race-neutral policies, not motivated by bias, by racial bias, race-neutral policies that have a different effect on African Americans than on whites. Because once you create a segregated system, a system of inequality, anything you do is going to impact different kinds of communities differently. So let me give you one example. I wrote another article about it, and I can send you the link to this one as well. Throughout the country, the property assessment system used by counties and cities to collect property taxes is racially discriminatory in effect, without having any implicit or explicit bias in the design of the property assessment system. In this article that I wrote, that I'll send you a link for, I use as an example Syracuse, another New York community. In Syracuse, the county and city had not done a systematic reassessment of properties for over 2 decades. Well, what's happened in the last 2 decades? Well, in those last 2 decades, homes in predominantly white neighborhoods appreciated in value much faster than homes in Black neighborhoods did. This is true all over the country. White neighborhoods have appreciated in value much more than Black neighborhoods have. Well, the result is that every year, homeowners in white neighborhoods had their property taxes based on an assessed value that was farther below the true market value of their homes than Black neighborhoods. Homes in Black neighborhoods are doing. Their assessed values were much closer to the true market values of their homes. The result is that African Americans in Syracuse have been paying property taxes that fund their schools and their libraries and their fire departments and other things that are dependent on property taxes, having a disproportionate responsibility for paying taxes to fund these. Now, certainly we need to reform the property tax assessment system in Syracuse. We need to do a regular reassessment if we want to rely on property taxes to fund schools and other public facilities in that community. But that's not going to refund to African Americans the excessive taxes that they've been paying for two decades. If they do a regular reassessment, it will prevent this from happening on an ongoing basis, but it will do nothing to undo the damage that the 2 decades of lagged assessments have created. And this is not a problem unique to Syracuse. Virtually every community in this country taxes African Americans at a higher effective rate than it taxes whites who own homes. We need explicit policies to redress this. As I say, we need refunds. And the only thing that can accomplish these refunds is a new civil rights movement that, like the civil rights movement of the 20th century, is going to, as again the late John Lewis described, make good trouble, create a demand, create pressure for that kind of refund that will help in part to redress the segregation that government has created. And there are many, many policies that we follow that similarly have a disparate impact, is the legal term that's used, a disparate impact on African Americans, not because they're racially motivated, not because they reflect either implicit or racial bias. Nobody claims that the reason that Syracuse didn't reassess their properties on a regular basis is because of racism. They just thought it was too much work to do it. It was more efficient, didn't cost as much not to do a regular reassessment. And as I say this, we've documented thousands of communities in this country, I'm not exaggerating, where there's a similar, for various reasons, a similar disparate impact on the property tax system. Well, I'll give you one other example, and then I'm watching the clock because I want to give you time for questions. It's not just because of lagged property tax assessments. How does a property tax assessor assess properties? The only way the property tax assessor can assess properties is by comparing the sale prices of nearby homes and judging the value of the home based on what prices nearby have sold for. Well, a property assessor can't go into a home to see what the value is. And so if the property assessor, for example, assumes that all two-bedroom, two-bath homes have similar values in the community, it's not going to pick up in its assessment practices the fact that homes owned by African Americans are likely to have less fancy amenities than a home of similar square footage, similar number of bedrooms in a white neighborhood. The result is that the value of the African American home is going to be misstated in the assessment system. And that also has this kind of disparate impact. So as again, I say, I'm writing a book about many, many of these kinds of policies that need to be redressed. It's not going to be easy. I'm also working, let me say, with a group of national civil rights leaders to create a new movement to redress racial segregation that will try to help organize local citizen groups to take the kind of action necessary to press their local communities, both private institutions, as I mentioned earlier, and public institutions, to take explicit affirmative action in housing policies to redress racial segregation. We call it the New Movement to Redress Racial Segregation. So again, I'll be writing about all of this and working with this group. And I want to thank you very much for your attention. Congratulations to all the graduates.